So we'll look at the first of this week's NCTs through use of just this basic progression. So again, just a very basic progression, a 1 chord, a 2-6-5, predominant leading into a 5 chord, and then of course resolving back to 1. So you see in this alteration here, I have delayed the arrival of the final C in the soprano by preceding it with a D just above it. And I want you to notice how it comes from the B. Of course, in order to get from B to D, we need to leap. So in introducing this first non-chord tone, the Appogiatura, we show how we approach the NCT by leap. And then after we arrive at the NCT, the D, which of course isn't part of the 1 chord, we resolve it down to a tonal pitch by step. So the Appogiatura works when we approach by leap and resolve by step. And Appogiaturas, important to note that they're typically going to occur on the beat. So in other words, the non-chord tone itself, or the pitch that doesn't belong to the chord, it will be accented, or it will sound with the rest of the chord. So here's what it sounds like in this context. So again, after the 5 chord, we arrive at that dissonant D, which it's kind of a nice way of delaying the tonic through the use of an NCT, and we leap into it, giving it a sense of drama. Hear it again. One thing I will say about the term Appogiatura, it's one of those musical terms that has actually taken on a couple of different meanings over time and over history. In the sense we're talking about it now, we're talking about a particular non-chord tone, one that is arrived at by leap and then resolved by step, often step in the opposite direction, which is what we have demonstrated here. And I suppose an older sense of the term, musically speaking, an Appogiatura really comes from its translation from the Italian, which means to lean on a note. So often you will find pieces in the repertoire where you're expected to kind of emphasize or lean on a dissonance, usually, which we would call an Appogiatura, even if it doesn't necessarily feature this approach by leap and resolve by step. Sometimes you will perform an Appogiatura on a note that arrives as a suspension, or an accented passing tone, or an accented neighbor, and that's kind of the NCT terminology we use now. But we would still kind of lean on those. So in kind of that, I guess, performer's sense, we would call it an Appogiatura. But in terms of the NCT, we're going to limit our use of the term Appogiatura for now, at least, to the NCT that is approached by leap and then resolved by step. So in this example, we're still talking about the Appogiatura, but what I've done is I've gone ahead and put a couple of different Appogiaturas, one in the soprano and one in the alto, and you'll notice how we label those. We circle the note just as we have with the other NCTs, so it's very clear which notes we're referring to, and we use the label APP, so again, abbreviation for Appogiatura. So here's this example with a dual Appogiatura kind of at the end of the progression here. So I'll play that again, and this time I'll kind of merge the meanings of Appogiatura, right, which is both a non-chord tone, but also gives a sense of really emphasizing that arrival. So that's a very typical way of performing an Appogiatura, whether it's an Appogiatura talked about as an NCT here, or whether it's an Appogiatura where you really kind of take the less strict meaning, where it's really any non-chord tone that you kind of lean on that arrival. And of course, to lean on that arrival means you're going to de-emphasize what comes after it. So we really highlight the dissonance in this case, or the pitches that really kind of make this thing a little more colorful in the harmony. As we get ready to talk about the escape tone, what I've done is I've altered the chord progression just a bit. You'll see that I've actually changed the tenor, and I'm having it step through a chordal 7th in the 5 chord. So the 5 chord matures, I guess you could say, into a 5/7. So let's see what that sounds like. So what that allowed me to do is have the alto resolve from the D down to the C. It can do that now because the tenor has the E covered at the end of the progression. So now what that does is it lets me show us an escape tone here. An escape tone is kind of the opposite in terms of approach and leaps from the Appogiatura. Remember, the Appogiatura is approached by leap and resolved by step in the opposite direction. Well, the escape tone is actually approached by step and then resolved by leap in the opposite direction. So you see the E here that I have in red shows up after the D in the alto. So we step up from the D to the E, and then we leave it by leap in the opposite direction, and that's how we get down to the C. So here is our escape tone. To introduce anticipations, I've returned to a version of our original progression, so back to just a normal 5-chord. Notice that in the soprano and alto, I've made the alterations again, but in this case, what's happening is rather than arrive to the C in the soprano at the very end and the E in the alto at the very end, right with the rest of the 1 chord, their notes actually appear just a little bit early, and that's exemplary of the anticipation. So here's what it sounds like in that context. So now we come to the pedal point. The pedal point is a unique non-chord tone for a number of reasons, one of which being that the preparation and the resolution require, in fact, mandate that there's no change in the actual pitch. So a pedal point is really just understood as a note that just sticks around, even though the harmonies come in which the pedal point pitch is not a member. So what I've done is I've created a minor version of the progression in which we have a 5/7, but you'll notice that the bass doesn't actually change from the C. So we still have a sense of a 2/7 chord as a second chord. We still have a sense of a dominant 5/7, but we get that even though, in spite of rather, the bass. So here's kind of what that can sound like. So I've done it in minor just because the pedal point tends to sound a little more dramatic, a little more exciting in minor contexts. You'll also notice that we have kind of a unique way of labeling the pedal point with respect to the other non-chord tones. You see we have the 1 labeled as a pedal underneath everything else, and the kind of the dotted line that shows that it kind of holds sway over this entire harmonic progression. Meanwhile, the other chords that we had, you see that we've reverted their labels to reflect kind of a root position rather than inversions, and we've also put them in parentheses, and that really just kind of helps reinforce the idea that the pedal, especially when it appears in the bass, which is where it's most likely to appear, really kind of holds some pretty commanding influence over the entire harmonic sense of what's going on, such that the other harmonies, even though they'll appear, they won't have the same kind of weight. So because the harmonies don't have as much weight independently with the pedal point present, it also means that the inversions of those harmonies are less influential as well. So we kind of dispense with the idea of inversions as long as there's a pedal present underneath.